Hi, my name is Nicole, and I want to start a new series of book reviews I might call book chats or book chapter chats. And that is because I've been going through some books recently and there's such useful information and I tend to forget. So doing a little review per chapter will help me remember, but maybe it's something that I can share with friends and family. And if anybody out there is interested in what I'm reading, and they want a little review or like someone else's opinion, then this might be a good resource. So the book that I just finished recently is called The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker. It was recommended in a podcast that I was listening to, and it's an excellent book. But I think that sometimes people might say, "Oh, this book is for women to read," because it's a good portion of it is focused on violence that happens towards women by spouses, by boyfriends, by even acquaintances that can't get over a relationship, that's not going to happen. And also it talks about different types of abuse having to do with women. So that's not most of the book. Most of the book, I would say, has to do with just different scenarios of violence. So there's a good portion about violence towards women, but I wouldn't even say that it's half the book. I would say it's definitely less than half. However, if you have a wife, if you have a daughter, if you have a sister, if you have a mother, you should read this book because it's a way to help you, have a conversation with them about their safety. And also things to look out for within your own family, red flags. I mean, you may have a child that's getting to an age where they're dating, or maybe they're working now, they're going to college, and there's a friend who's just kind of acting a little bit strange. And having some familiarity with this book will really point out red flags. Instead of just calling someone weird, there might be more to it than that. Of course, sometimes people are just weird. So I'm going to do this chapter at a time. I'm going to start with chapter 1 and just kind of summarize the things that I like and the things that I think are useful to know. And I'm going to read some of it because I can't remember some of it. But the first couple pages is talking about a lady named Kelly, a young woman in her 20s, who's walking home, not really walking home, walking from her car to her apartment, and she's taking her groceries up. And the apartment building has a door that's supposed to be locked, but this time it was ajar. So when she goes through that main door, she pushes it closed so it locks, and then she continues to go up 4 flights of stairs to carry her groceries up. When she's almost to the top, some cans of cat food fell out and rolled down and around the corner, and somebody really quickly said, "Oh, no problem, I'll bring that up for you." And with that first voice that she heard, she felt like something's off. This doesn't feel right. And when the person comes around the corner, it's a clean-cut male, friendly, making small talk with her, offering to help her with her bags. They look too heavy. And so her instinct's telling her no. She's like, I have it, no thank you. And then all of a sudden, he says something like, "Oh, well, there's such a thing as being too prideful." And that's actually, as you get into the book, there's all these little things, there's a little manipulation tactics that people like that, not all people, but people who are out to hurt you will use. And that's one of them, basically making her feel guilty about something so that she can have to try to correct it. And so she does. And she's like, she thinks about it for a second, then she kind of hands the bag over to him. So, but it's not really in a super rude way, just enough to make you feel like you have to defend your honor and who you are. So this is really interesting. And she ends up being raped and who knows what else, abused possibly for 3 hours. And then before he's about to leave, she said he gets dressed, he closes the bedroom window, and he says, "I have to go somewhere." He acts like he's in a hurry, and he says, "I have to leave." He looks at his watch, and he says, and he has a gun, mind you, and he's had a gun to her head, throughout this process, once he got into her apartment, and basically when she let him into the apartment, but that's for you to read. And then she said once he got dressed and said he had to leave, she felt the most fear that she felt through the whole experience. Even though it was a horrible experience, she felt like this gut-wrenching fear. She says even more so than when he had a gun to her head. And what Gavin DeBecker calls that is true fear. And so when he turns around to leave, spoiler alert, there's going to be spoilers because I'm going to just basically talk about the whole book. When the man turns around to leave, she gets up from the bed, and after he told her to stay there with her blanket, and she's like basically ghost following him down her hallway, and he doesn't realize she's right behind him. And every step he takes, she takes, and when he paused, she paused. And then he kind of like turned the radio up because he walked by one of her stereos, and then he went further into the kitchen, opening up the drawers. So when he turned left into the kitchen, she turned right into the living room and went straight through the front door into her neighbor's apartment across the way, which Gavin brings out. She instinctively knew that their house would be unlocked because, you know, she's familiar with her neighbors and things. And when she gets in there, she closes the door, locks it, and she tells him to be quiet. And from that point forward, you know, she basically saved her life, because what she finds out later is that this same guy raped and murdered another woman, if not more than one other woman. And, you know, Gavin's asking her, like, why were you so fearful in that moment? And she says, I don't know. And then he says he always waits, gives them a little bit of time, and then people always start thinking and kind of pulling the pieces together. And for her, she said, well, I guess it was because he closed the window. And he said he was leaving, so there was no need for him to close the window. At one point, she says, I was certain that he was going to kill me. So him closing the window was her first clue. And as she was following him down the hallway, he turned up the stereo. And then as she left, once she got to her neighbor's apartment, I think there was even more proof that he was going to kill her, in retrospect, of course, because he turned the radio up, he closed the window, he went into the kitchen drawers, he was going to get a knife. She realizes later that he was concerned about the noise of the gun, so that's why he went to the kitchen to get the knife out of the drawer and also turn the radio up, because there was no reason for him to stay. He could have just walked out the front door. The interesting thing about her experience is that it was, I guess, in my opinion, it's what some people call like an out-of-body experience. But what it really was just her fear guiding her to safety. What Gavin says about this is that Kelly experienced real fear, not like when we're startled, not like the fear that we feel at a movie or the fear of public speaking. He says that this real fear will tell you what to do. And sometimes it tells a person to play dead, or to stop breathing, or to run, or to scream, or to fight. But to Kelly, it said, just be quiet and don't doubt me and I'll get you out of here. Oh, Kelly later describes a fear so complete that it replaced every feeling in her body. She says, I had nothing to do with it. I was a passenger moving down that hallway. So I guess one of the biggest takeaways I get from this book, and especially from chapter 1, is that true fear is something that you'll rarely ever experience. Even if someone startles the heck out of you and, you know, you scream, or, you know, I think even when you're, you know, in a car and a car pulls in front of you and you feel that adrenaline come out of you and your heart starts pumping, all of those things are not the true fear. The true fear is basically the thing that happens in that life or death moment where your instincts will take over and it'll tell you what to do. And what he tells people is that even though there's scenarios where you want to have plans, like, okay, if there was an active shooter, this, or, you know, if somebody ever grabbed me from behind, I would, you know, fill in the blank. And that's good to know, but he says none of it is candy cutter. You cannot say that one reaction or one scenario or even 3 scenarios is going to be the answer to dealing with that risk and that threat in that moment, because every situation is different and nobody can really know. So somebody might have told this girl, Kelly, you should have found a weapon in your room and you should have hid behind the door and waited for him to come back and all this stuff. But it doesn't really matter what someone advises you. what matters is to listen to your instincts. Follow their instincts and they'll get you to safety. That's the bottom line. And just not really having like a diehard plan, but just listen to your body, and whatever it's telling you to do, go with it. Don't fight it. If in her case, her body was telling her, you can't get out of here in time, get a weapon and be ready, that's what she should have done. But to say that that's the answer every time, or if someone else told you what you should have done, the answer to that is that's not true. They can't know because they weren't there and it wasn't their body talking to them. He says, like every creature, you can know when you are in the presence of danger. You have the gift of a brilliant internal guardian that stands ready to warn you of hazards and guide you through risky situations. He says when he asks people who've suffered violence, could you have seen this coming? Most of them say, no, it just came out of nowhere. But if I'm quiet, if I wait a moment, here comes the information. Someone will say, I felt uneasy when I first met that guy. Or now that I think of it, I was suspicious when he approached me. Or I realize now I had seen that car earlier in the day. Of course, if they realize it now, they knew it then. We all see the signals because there is a universal code of violence. You'll find some of what you need to break that code in the following chapters, but here's the clincher. Most of it is in you. If you've ever seen the show Lie to Me, it's about a team that like works for the government who are like human lie detectors, and they pick up on micro expressions. So like if somebody does like an ear scratch when they're being interviewed, that means something. And so basically, even without training, we have the exact same abilities, not to the degree of the show, but to the degree that we need it. So what he mentions is that our own life experience, like knowing what expectations are normal in a certain setting, can alarm you and alert you to unusual expectations that are starting to happen. And you may not actually pinpoint it in the moment. You'll just feel off. You'll feel a little bit scared, a little bit nervous, intuitively like something is wrong. And that's for your time to say, I'm probably going to leave this store. Or, you know what, this guy is too weird. I'm going to go hang out with my friend until he leaves, or whatever. So the intuition actually is not the same thing as the true fear. Those are two different things. So the intuition is warning you that something's off. Just like when that little lady, Kelly, dropped the cans down the stairwell, she heard that guy's voice. Just from the very get-go, she felt something was off. And the true fear kicked in when he was right before he was about to kill her. And she picked up on all these micro signals, these little clues like in the back of her subconscious that he was about to do this crime. So I guess the biggest takeaway that I got from this book is don't disregard your intuition. It's there for a reason. It's not like it's not coming out of the thin air. I think that's what I've always thought, is that intuition comes out of the thin air and it's just a feeling, but it's not based on anything. And what Gavin DeBecker explains is that intuition is not out of the thin air. It is based on something. It's based on things that you're picking up on. It's based on things that are not right, not normal. It's basically like those little micro movements, and some of these aren't micro movements, they're larger, but it's things that you are picking up on. It's based on reality and not just a random kind of ghostly feeling. It's not that. Another good point he makes about intuition is that it may be hard to accept its importance because intuition is usually looked upon by us thoughtful Western beings with contempt. It is often described as emotional, unreasonable, or inexplainable. Husbands chide their wives about feminine intuition and they don't take it seriously. We much prefer logic, the grounded, explainable, unemotional thought process that ends in a supportable conclusion. In fact, Americans worship logic even when it's wrong and deny intuition even when it's right. So it's kind of good to have this kind of like face-to-face, this concept, because I do feel like there's a lot of truth in that. And some people call the intuition something else. They might call it a gut feeling, but it's still basically the same. He says, intuition connects us to the natural world and to our nature, freed from the bonds of judgment, married only to perception. It carries us to predictions we will later marvel at. quote unquote, somehow I knew. So when you get that thought, somehow I knew, that was your intuition talking. What he brings out is also that people do things that some say came out of the blue, or it happened all of a sudden, it happened out of nowhere. But these phrases support the popular myth that predicting human behavior isn't possible. Yet to successfully navigate through morning traffic, we make amazingly accurate high-stakes predictions about the behavior of literally thousands of people. So he's trying to say that human behavior, especially when it comes to violence, is actually very predictable. And if we are exposed to violence from humans, more than likely it will be by somebody you know. Maybe not a relative, although that's possible, but maybe even someone you work with, someone you go to school with. So we do want to look for some of these clues sometimes when there are things that are more obviously happening. Maybe a disgruntled employee, and this book goes over that too, things to look for. Some of it is based on things to look for, which he calls PINs, pre-incident indicators. And some of these things are intuition. So I guess this whole book kind of talks about different ways in which you can detect violence, but his main concern is not detecting violence as much as it is predicting how safe you're going to be. So his end goal is always safety of the person. It's not really to get you the most justice out of the justice system. It's basically to keep you alive. So sometimes people feel like, oh, well, if I handle it this way, that's, so unjust. Like I should have filed a lawsuit and this and that. But in certain cases, he says, definitely leave the court system out of it. Go with your instincts, because sometimes that's the final straw that people need before they act on a violent behavior. So, it's not always about getting justice. Sometimes it's just about being safe. He brings out the human violence we abhor and fear the most, that which we call random and senseless, is neither. It always has purpose and meaning, to the perpetrator at least. As long as we label it senseless, we will not make sense of it. So he brings out different ways that we can make sense of people's behavior. And, if you're suspicious about somebody, kind of studying their thoughts and their actions and the way they, deal with problems, and maybe they'll reveal to you, over a lunch break or something, what's going on with them at home. And these are all clues. So the things that people do, it's really not out of nowhere. Of course, he likes to point out how newscasters will always say, like, who could have predicted such a heinous crime? But the point Gavin DeBecker always makes is somebody could have predicted it. And maybe quite a few people could have predicted it. He brings out that we want to believe that people are infinitely complex with millions of motivations and varieties of behavior. It is not so. We want to believe with all the possible combinations of human beings and human feelings, predicting violence is as difficult as picking the winning lottery ticket. Yet it usually isn't difficult at all. So he really does break down throughout this book, like how to spot things that are off, and using your instincts, but also using those pre-incident indicators, and even more. He has another system called Mosaic, where he also breaks down the possibility of threats and things like that. So in this book, I will read life's highest stake questions that can be answered. Will a person I am worried about try to harm me? Will the employee I must fire react violently? How should I handle the person who refuses to let go? What is the best way to respond to threats? What are the dangers posed by strangers? That rhymes. How can I know a babysitter won't turn out to be someone who harms my child? How can I know whether some friend of my child might be dangerous? Is my own child displaying the warning signs of future violence? Finally, how can I help my loved ones be safer? So all of these questions are answered in this book. And then near the end of this first chapter, he talks about his personal life story, growing up in a violent, abusive home where his mother had accidentally fired a gun towards his head, and he could even hear the bullets go by, and where he was he witnessed, you know, people being shot in his home. So he comes from a very violent upbringing, and he's one of those people who, instead of becoming violent himself, basically went the complete opposite direction and helped people in violent situations. He is very, very credible. He's been doing this job for, well, since this book came out in the 90s, but there was a newer copyright from 2021, so I'm assuming that some of the statistics are updated in here. He has a firm called Gavin DeBecker and Associates, and he works with federal government agencies, the CIA. He works with prosecutors, battered women's shelters, giant corporations, universities, television stars, television stations, police departments, cities, states, movie studios, cultural figures, religious leaders, champion athletes, politicians, recording artists, movie stars, college students. The list goes on and on and on. And he's traveled to many different countries and continents, studying and learning about violence in those places as well, because some of the violence and threats that he has to deal with are involving threats from other countries. So it makes sense that he goes to study. He's worked with the Oscar Awards and the Emmys, and the threats that they've encountered, and also just not just the threats, but trying to eliminate the possibility of any hazards happening during those shows. He also mentions that his firm advises famous people who are the targets of unwanted pursuers, stalkers, and would-be assassins. He says most people do not realize that media figures are at the center of a swirl of desperate and often alarming pursuers. Fewer still realize that the stalking of regular citizens is an epidemic affecting hundreds of thousands each year. So I didn't realize it myself that stalkers was such a thing, such a big deal. But as you go through the book, you'll learn. We'll learn more. So he brings out, after discussing how intuition works for you and how denial works against you, I'll show that fear, which can be central to your safety, is frequently misplaced. I'll show how you can tell the difference between a real warning and mere words. I'll identify the specific survival signals we get from people who harm us, or who might harm us. I'll start with the danger posed by strangers. This is the violence that captures our fear and attention. Even though only 20% of all homicides are committed by strangers, the other 80% are committed by people we know. So I'll focus on those we hire, those we work with, those we fire, those we date, those we marry, those we divorce. And in chapter 15, which I think that's the last chapter, this whole book is super good. It'll suck you right in, like the moment you start reading it. I'm just trying to do this breakdown for myself as a reminder, and for people I know, and hopefully if anyone's interested and they just want to drive and they don't want to like have to read anything, or it's kind of like a shorter way to go through it. But chapter 15 I love. It's kind of more almost like personal growth chapter in a way, because it really covers a lot of the psychology behind anxiety and fear, and how it's actually dangerous to walk around with a lot of anxiety, because we're always at this like heightened state of alert. Then when things start going off, or things start happening that are not normal, we are going to be less able to perceive those things, those threats, and our intuition isn't going to be as sharp, because we're always walking around with this fear. So if we walked around with less anxiety, when something was off, it would alert us and would be a lot more aware of it, instead of just thinking of everything as a threat all the time. So I think 15 is great. Like if you just read 15, like that chapter alone is super useful. But honestly, the whole book is a must read. So definitely pick it up and take a read. If not, just keep watching this series that I'm planning to do, where I will talk about each chapter, like some of the best points that I liked and I think are useful to note, one at a time. Okay, thanks for listening.